Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Weekly Battle Report. Today is Wednesday, August 27th. I'm Michelle Aaron, your host. We're now just 1 week before a series of major international conferences and celebrations to take place in the Far East. The Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok, Russia. The Tianjin Summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the military parade scheduled for September 3rd in China's Tiananmen Square to mark the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, which commemoration is the subject of the urgent appeal by Helga LaRouche and now 97 prominent co-signers that the presidents of the United States, Russia, and China might there meet. Will fora like these, which promote economic and cultural cooperation among nations, continue to host an amazing array of nations like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and many, many developing nations from the global south, but without the full-fledged participation of leading nations of the West, the United States, Germany, France, England, and others, which nations currently cling to an old, collapsing paradigm of wars, looting, and destruction. Or can we provoke these nations, currently tightly gripped to their own self-destruction, to join the new paradigm of peace and development? Can we advance the new potential that was created just a couple of weeks ago by US President Donald Trump's successful summit with Russia's Vladimir Putin, showing that our two nations can work together, and which summit has Western media and leaders of Europe and the United States reeling? Or will that potential be lost in the shuffle of trade wars, economic collapse, and the aiding and abetting of genocide currently taking place in Gaza? This question, those outcomes, that's up to us. It's up to the citizenry of our many nations to organize a positive outcome. We're going to take a look this evening at several examples over the past week where the LaRouche movement continued its 50-year mobilization to accomplish that miracle. We're going to start with an excerpt from President of the LaRouche Organization, Diane Sayre's TikTok of this past Friday, where she begins by addressing the raid on the home of neocon John Bolton that was done as part of the house cleaning of Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard.
My day got off to a very good start today when I read the news that John Bolton's home had been raided by the FBI. Long overdue, justly deserved. For those of you who don't remember, John Bolton personally worked to sabotage President Trump's negotiations with North Korea in the first term, threatening North Korea with the Gaddafi treatment. Remember, that was when Gaddafi agreed and got rid of all research facilities or intent to develop a nuclear weapon, for which he was rewarded by having his government overthrown and died a horrible death being tortured and raped while being dragged through the streets, over which Hillary Clinton chuckled and said, "We came, we saw, he died." How sick. Would be nice to see her house raided, by the way. But on Bolton, he also undermined President Trump's orders to remove American troops from Syria in the first term, which also should have been done. So it looks like Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel are doing a number clearing out the warmongers and the traitors in our intelligence agencies. It was also reported apparently yesterday that DNI Gabbard gave orders that people involved in the mediation between the United States and Russia, between President Trump and President Putin, should not be sharing intelligence on the details of these negotiations with our so-called allies. Now, I will tell you, this is not Gabbard speaking, this is me, Diane Sayre. Our so-called allies, namely MI6 and Mossad, are not our allies. They're trying to undermine our nation. They're trying to hijack us and get us into wars which will not benefit our people and won't benefit their people, but may make a handful of billionaires richer for the few remaining years of their lives. That's a disgusting policy. So let's continue this course. Let's continue the talks between the U.S. and Russia to end this bloody proxy war in Ukraine. Let's build the Bering Strait tunnel across the Bering Strait. Let's shift our relationship to Asia and Russia.
Thank you, Diane. So this intervention by Diane on TikTok is a tremendous example of organizing. You see that she goes after the bad guys, but she comes back to what we are fighting for. And that is the crucial quality of leadership that the LaRouche movement carries into battle. Now, another point of leadership has been the role of the LaRouche movement for decades in exposing and denouncing the role of British imperial forces upon a United States whose principled origins and history were good. Let's watch now a moment from the Q&A at the Icarus Conference in Rutherford, New Jersey, with the Gray Zone, where LaRouche independent candidate for Congress in the Bronx, Jose Vega, brought in the question of the qualified optimism of those who know the real history of the United States. And he asks Speaker Kit Klarenberg to speak on how the British influence American policy.
I want to thank all the speakers for your presentations, and I specifically want to thank Kit Klarenberg for being the most pro-American and optimistic on the panel, which is kind of funny given that he's not from here. But I just kind of wanted to respond a little bit to the pessimism that, you know, it seems to be apparent in the people here who are on stage, because what Kit Klarenberg was going through about, you know, American history and specifically our anti-British sentiments that wasn't so long ago, I think is what makes us powerful as Americans. I think back to people like President Kennedy when he made a declaration at the United Nations in 1963, 2 months before he was assassinated, where he told the Soviets directly, "I want to work with you on joint space exploration," as a way to end the Cold War. And then he was assassinated 2 months later. Now, whether or not you think his intentions were pure and true, I think as Americans, we have something enshrined in us that when government becomes destructive of these ends, we are to alter or abolish it. And I think it's our role to educate our fellow Americans that we have that. It's why I'm running for Congress. You know, my mom isn't a movie director. She didn't make Mississippi Masala.
What's your name?
Jose Vega.
Oh, you're Jose. Hi, Jose.
Hi. And, you know, my dad's not a famous academician. You know, no hate on Zoran, really. I hope he does great, but, you know, I come from nothing. And so I would just encourage other Americans to not give in to the pessimism. And so to that end, I would just hope that Kit, well, I have two questions. One, Kit, if you could just expand a little bit more on the anti-British sentiments American citizens had in the 20th century. Like, for example, Henry Kissinger talked about how he kept his British intelligence friends more closely briefed than he did his Americans. And secondly, to Glenn Deason, you, I think a month ago, were talking about Friedrich List, the economist, and you were talking about Henry Carey as solution concepts for what the real alternatives could be. And I thought that was great, you know, because as much as we talk about the doom and gloom, I think a real solution concept is what makes people optimistic, like what the world could be. So those are my two questions.
Thank you. Kit? Take it away.
Okay, sure. So, number one, Jose, I obviously can't vote for you, but I would.
All right.
If I was
I'm
in
gonna
any
clip that.
position to do so. Yeah, please do, please do. You know, my rates are good, but like in all seriousness, like I think that, yeah, I mean, look. It must never be forgotten, right, that like the most common national holiday in the world is Freedom from Britain Day. And it is celebrated on average every 6 days somewhere in the world, right? Okay, so like, and now if you go back to the early 1950s when the British was at war with Mossadegh, the elected leader of Iran, Mossadegh did a tour of the US in which he framed his battle against the British state and particularly BP, which was raping and pillaging Iran's vast oil reserves. He framed it as, in the same terms as America's struggle for independence against the British in 1776. His political, public, and media audiences were typically very receptive to this, okay? The coup that removed Mossadegh from power was a result of the MI6 manipulating the CIA and the State Department into backing it. Okay, this is not a natural strand of American thinking, as hard as that is to believe for some people. Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, when he rid his country both of the imperialist Japanese but also the Vichy French, he read out a Declaration of Independence for Vietnam, which was almost identical to the US Declaration of Independence. Like America's struggle for independence from Britain was a inspiring rallying call for colonized, oppressed people the world over. Okay, it is a very recent thing in history that America has filled this imperial role. And so frequently it has been at the direct or indirect behest of the British. That's not to say that America is completely innocent in this. I don't take that view, but so when we look all over the world, particularly flashpoints now, Ukraine, as we've discussed, being led by the British, Syria, where HTS seized power with the assistance of an MI6 connected organization run by the foreign and defense advisor of the current British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, called Intermediate. They have an office in the Syrian presidential palace. Okay, so much of US policy is informed by the British going around the world, starting fires, hoping that the Americans will either extinguish the blaze on their behalf or pour more petrol on, depending on their interests and wishes at the time. Okay, like neutralizing that British influence would go a significant way to, I think, a more sensible, less belligerent US foreign policy as a result.
All right, and you heard Klarenberg ending his comments by saying that if we were to neutralize that British influence, it would go a significant way to create a more sensible, less belligerent US foreign policy. The LaRouche organization a couple of months ago released our latest dossier, Worse Than Treason, the Actual Motive Behind Russiagate. I read from the introduction, the reason for the British orchestrated confrontation between the United States and Russia was so that the British could consolidate a global financial empire based on depopulation and looting of raw materials and labor. And we go through in depth the details behind that in this dossier, which is right now, circulating at high levels and which we got into the halls of Congress a couple of weeks ago. We have now a short report from Denmark to show the continuing participation of the LaRouche movement in the very necessary demonstrations taking place all around the world to protest genocide in Gaza. this is in Denmark, where the recent announcement by Israel's Bibi Netanyahu of the intent to invade Gaza and expel all of the Palestinian people from there has catalyzed a huge increase in protests against Israel's policies. Schiller Institute's Farida Gillisberg was at a demonstration of over 70,000 people in front of the Danish parliament on Sunday. She will give a short statement and we'll see a bit of the crowd.
This is Farida Gillisberg from the Schiller Institute in Denmark. I'm right now at the square at the Danish parliament. This is the biggest demonstration for Palestine to stop the genocide, to stop Israel from starving the population to death. You know, there is a big movement in Denmark on the streets here at the parliament.
Thank you very much, Farida. We now have a short excerpt from the first section of today's weekly webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Today's webcast was titled, "Who is the Real Nordstream Bomber?" And the opening section had an analysis by Mrs. LaRouche and TLO President Diane Serre of a hearing held yesterday at the United Nations Security Council following the August 3rd surprise arrest in Italy of a Ukrainian citizen who is accused of perpetrating the bombing from a tiny yacht. And reason largely defies the possibility that this individual could have accomplished the bombing without the support of NATO countries. It was in NATO-controlled waters. It was 80 meters down below sea level, or the sea surface. So full coverage of the hearing is available in today's EIR Daily Alert. If you are not yet a subscriber, you may subscribe directly at eir.news, or you will receive the Daily Alert if you become a sustaining member of the LaRouche organization. It was very good coverage. Now, here is a short excerpt from that discussion where TLO President Diane Serre gives an important insight into why it is of utmost concern, including to nations like China, India, others, to find out who was responsible.
Denmark concluded absolutely it was sabotage. That was their first, but there was no basis for a criminal investigation. Now, how can you on the one hand say that something was sabotage and then there's no basis for a criminal investigation? It really boggles the mind. And I think that people are concerned about it because if the bankrupt transatlantic elites really want to declare war on the BRICS, which are building phenomenal infrastructure all over the world, the new Shanghai port. Brazil just signed a memorandum of understanding with China to build the Bioceanic Corridor. Clearly, any nation involved in making an investment in major transnational projects of cooperation and collaboration should be very concerned if nobody is ever brought to justice for this crime.
So please watch the full webcast, which is available right now on Schiller Institute platforms, which goes on to a extremely in-depth, substantial discussion on the elephant in the room, which is the collapse of the economies of Europe and the United States. Also, that given that collapse, there is the danger in the United States that a President Trump, who is now deploying National Guard forces in the states, would use this force to ensure a fascist financial policy. And perhaps most to the point of what we ourselves need to do, that we need a movement of citizens demanding a better economy. So the full webcast is available, and we'll work to make excerpts of some of the most pressing sections available as well. We conclude with one item of LaRouche in the news this week. On Monday, August 25th, the English language Chinese newspaper Global Times interviewed Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche in the second installment of their new series titled Steering the New Era. The full article, titled China Proposed Global Civilization Initiative, will contribute to eventually making war obsolete. The full article is linked in this video description, and we're going to read a short excerpt from the conclusion of the interview. Helga says, "The most important thing that China and Western countries should do is officially initiate the creation of a new global security and development architecture, which must take into account the interests of every single country on the planet. The two most important principles are, first, that for the sake of peace, one has to take into account the interest of the other, and that means all others. And second, one has to replace the policy of revenge with a policy of love. China's 3 global initiatives absolutely correspond to that approach, and especially the Global Civilization Initiative. Opening a true dialogue of civilizations can awaken the minds and hearts of people to arrive at a new epoch in the history of mankind, where we become truly human." So, we saw this evening a nice little roundup of organizing by the LaRouche movement over the past week to create a paradigm of peace and development. We saw how TLO President Diane Serre is taking advantage of online social media platforms like TikTok to get out the word, take down the criminals, but also never forget to organize for the solutions that you are trying to create. We saw during the event where Jose Vega spoke at the mic that his work, his campaign are known and respected, and hopefully we all learned from his example that if you put the right questions on the table, you can shape the discussion that follows. We saw from the report from Farida Gillesberg from Denmark that we are present at the needed demonstrations against genocide in Gaza. And we saw that international media, in this case, China's English language Global Times, wish to gain the input of Schiller Institute founder and the wife of Lyndon LaRouche, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. So we ask you to get out there and organize this coming week and take photos of your activity, do video shorts. If you aren't prepared to do a video report but want to send in some write-up notes on your organizing activities, what you did, what the responses were, we would love to hear from you. You can send your reports in to info@laroucheorganization.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll